Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to AFIO's 148th Luncheon. As you know, AFIO has some increasing visibility around Washington. This morning's Washington Post had an article, and we've been accused of arranging it as an introduction to our speakers today. Nonetheless, we have a great session for you. We're going to start with one of the most interesting speakers that we've known. AFIO's known him since long before he retired. As a matter of fact, this morning's Post article described the problems that some book writers are having with the CIA's Publications Review Board. Well, it turns out, obviously, there's two reasons why Brian Latell may have gotten his book cleared so quickly and easily. He was one of the pioneers that set up and pushed the Publications Review Board and their new openness. But anyway, Brian was the CIA's National Intelligence Officer and expert for Latin America, and I understand, according to Brian, that includes Cuba. Well, it turns out that he was head of the Center for the Study of Intelligence for a while, but everyone is aware of his new book and the crisis. But I don't want to waste any more time except to say, welcome to Brian Latell.
Thank you all for being here. What a distinguished group of old friends and colleagues. It's really a pleasure to be here. I served on the board of AFIO for 2 terms, so it's an organization that I'm very fond of and very close to. And thank you all for being here. A note, the Publications Review Board was very good to me. They asked me to change about 12 words. And if you've read, those of you who have read the book, you might be surprised. I was very surprised that they didn't ask me for much more. There were really no deletions, just words, single words, 2 or 3 words here and there throughout the 100,000 words of Castro's secrets. And there's a lot in the book that I think people at the agency must still consider to be embarrassing. I'll mention some of those as I go along. But no, the Publications Review Board was very professional, very reasonable. We went through this, in a very fine fashion. The book is about Castro. It's about the Kennedy brothers. It's about the CIA, but mostly it's about Cuban intelligence. And especially it's about the Cuban Supreme Spy Master. We think of Fidel Castro, we all recognize Fidel Castro, 53 years on the world stage, 48 years running, dominating every aspect of Cuban life. And we know him, we recognize him in so many of his roles, capacities. He was the head of the Cuban Communist Party, the founder of the modern Cuban Communist Party. He was the president of the Council of Ministers and the president of the Council of State. So he ran cabinet meetings and he organized and ran and manipulated the Cuban leadership. He was the commander-in-chief of the Cuban Armed Forces for 48 years. He ran Cuban expeditionary forces in distant countries, in Angola and Ethiopia, where 50 and 30,000 Cuban troops, respectively, worked to advance Cuban revolutionary Marxist-Leninist interests. We recognize Fidel Castro in those and other capacities too. The great performer, the world-class performer on the global stage, the man of the world's probably most recognized orator. A leader who spoke more words on the public record during his 48 years than any leader in history. The one role that we don't associate with Fidel Castro is the one that he cherished the most, the one he enjoyed and thrived in the most. For 48 years, he was Cuba's supreme spy master. There was no major Cuban intelligence operation during all of those years until he stepped down in 2006, stepped aside. There was no major intelligence operation that Fidel Castro did not himself orchestrate, run, and micromanage. One of the principal sources for Castro's secret is a defector from Cuban intelligence. Many of you will recognize his name, Florentino Aspillaga. I spent about 15 hours with a tape recorder meeting with Aspillaga. He lives with a new identity. He has to, because he was the target of at least 2 Cuban intelligence assassination attempts. One came very, very close to succeeding. He miraculously survived it. That story is in the book. Aspillaga told me many stories about Fidel, the supreme spy master. I'll just share a few with you. There was a very, very high-level mole. I call him the super mole, that operated at a very high level of the American government in Washington. It might have been in the CIA or possibly in the Pentagon. We don't know for sure. At least Aspillaga and I don't know for sure. But this was a man of very high rank, sub-cabinet level rank, and he was Fidel Castro's personal super mole in Washington. Fidel selected one Cuban case officer to meet with the American. When the case officer and the American would travel to third countries, they would meet clandestinely. The case officer would present the super mole with questions that had been provided to him by Fidel Castro, because these are the things that Fidel himself wanted to know. The mole would provide the answers. The case officer would get back to Havana and not meet with anybody except Fidel. He went straight to Fidel's quarters, and he was debriefed by Fidel on the meetings with this super mole. And that's the way the clandestine relationship was conducted. 3 men knew the identity of the super mole. And I don't think he's ever been, maybe there's some FBI officers here who can correct me, but I don't think he was ever apprehended, charged, possibly not even ever neutralized. Fidel, the mole, and the case officer were the only 3. It was that tightly compartmented. And that's the way Fidel wanted it. Fidel was the mastermind behind what is probably modern history's most remarkable sustained double agent operation, or series of operations. It's sad to say, sad to admit, that the CIA was duped and deceived and tricked by Cuban intelligence, led by Fidel, for many, many years. And there were 48 or 49 agents, Cubans, recruited by the CIA, paid and subsidized and supported by the CIA. These 48 or 49 Cubans from many walks of life and many different professions, they reported information to the CIA that was considered to be valuable. Every one of them was a double agent run by Cuban intelligence, and the entire double cross, Cuban double cross, if you will, was run and managed by Fidel. Fidel was often the person who decided on the feed that the agents, the chicken feed that the agents would provide to the agency. He was often the one who even selected and recruited individuals to be double agents. We didn't know about this until Florentino Aspillaga defected in June of 1987. And he pulled the plug on this operation. He revealed it. And you can imagine how shocked intelligence officers were, not just CIA, but from the FBI and from other places as well. We were shocked. But Florentino Aspillaga's value as a defector, as an intelligence source, began in those moments when he started to reveal the incredible successes that the Cubans had run against us. He told me about the super mole. He told me about, I didn't meet him until 2007. It was long after his defection. I never met him when I was working on Cuba and Latin American affairs in the agency. So when I met him in 2007, we were just beginning a friendship. He told me, and he told his debriefers after when he defected, that there was a professor, an American-born woman. I want to mention this case because I often in Miami, I'm living much of the time in Miami now, I often get questions at the University of Miami about this sort of thing. This woman was a professor, American-born professor, and this was in the 70s, and she was just enamored of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. She just thought the Cuban Revolution was the victim, the hopeless, helpless victim of American imperialism. There is some truth to that. But she became so enamored of the Cuban Revolution that she traveled there and did volunteer work, I think in the sugarcane fields. And like most of the sugarcane volunteers in those days, she became immediately a target of Cuban intelligence, and she was recruited. And she became a loyal reporting source. Now, she couldn't report on anything classified, but she was able to indoctrinate her students and proceeded to do that shamelessly. And one of her students, a young Latin American man, she felt, with the guidance of her Cuban case officer, she felt that this was someone who might prove especially valuable to Cuban intelligence. So she worked on him and gradually indoctrinated him into her way of thinking, the Cuban way of thinking, and he was recruited. But the recruitment took place in a third country. She traveled with this young man to a third country, sympathetic, friendly to Cuba, and there she turned this young man over to her Cuban case officer, who then went about completing the recruitment. And the mission for this young man was to apply for a job at the CIA. And he did. And I think that he was probably trained in methods that the Cubans had developed to defeat the polygraph. And it was when Florentino Aspiaga defected, with that knowledge, that he was able to foil the plot. The young man never got the job at CIA. Aspiaga had enough information about him that he was identified. People ask me in Miami all the time, because we had a professor at Florida International University who was arrested a few years ago for being an agent, an undeclared agent of the Cuban government. He couldn't be charged with espionage because he didn't have access to classified information, and I guess there just wasn't a strong enough evidence trail. But he had been an agent for the Cuban government at Florida International University, a big school, 40,000 in Miami, 40,000 students. And his wife, his name is Alvarez, Carlos Alvarez. He's out of prison now. He served about 3 or 4 years, and his wife was prosecuted as well. I don't know if he recruited any of his students. I don't know if he did what this woman professor did. But this is why we have to be concerned about Cuban intelligence getting onto campuses around the country and having the kind of impact that it has had. Aspiaga told me many other stories, and so many of them relate to Cuban intelligence. I interviewed a number of other defectors from Cuban intelligence. Before I get to the most startling, the most shocking thing that Aspiaga told me, let me just tell you a little more about the methodology of my book. There were about 13 defectors from Cuban intelligence and Cuban security who speak in the book. Most of them I interviewed. Some of them live with new identities, and many of them I protect. I don't use their true names, but several of them speak in the book in true name. I also went to the National Archives, went to a website that has a lot of declassified CIA documents. And in the process of researching this book over 4.5 years, I read between 40 and 50,000 pages of declassified CIA documents. They're all declassified under the terms of the Kennedy Assassination Records Act. And most of them were declassified in the organization that I ran during my last tour at CIA when I was the director of the Center for the Study of Intelligence. So I interviewed these Cuban defectors. I read these tens of thousands of declassified documents. I interviewed quite a few retired CIA officers and quite a few others. So the book derives from all of that. It's very richly sourced. There are more than 500 source notes at the end of the book, but it's not an academic book. It's not written as an academic book. It's written for popular audiences. The most startling thing that Aspiaga told me, and some of you may already know about this because there's been some press about it. In our first meeting, fairly soon into our first meeting, Aspiaga told me something that just about knocked me off my chair. He was he was a counterintelligence officer for most of his career. And he worked in intercept operations. And he was assigned as a very young officer. He was only 17 years old when he was assigned to an intercept site west of Havana. It was at a place called Jaimanitas. It was near the Hemingway Marina, if any of you have been down that way. And he worked at this site to track CIA communications. This was during the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy administration, working mainly through CIA under the driving, pounding force, unrelenting force of Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General. The mission was to get rid of Fidel Castro. Kennedy brothers wanted Castro gone. And they were willing to do just about anything, including assassination operations, as we know. The Cuban intelligence mission that Aspiaga had was to track CIA communications. JM Wave was our station in Miami. It was the largest station in the world by far. So he tracked communications from there. And his post at Jaimanitas was nicely situated, to track communications out of JM Wave. I'm not saying that that they could all be understood, but that was the mission. And also Langley, and also the ships, the many CIA ships that were hovering off the Cuban coast, delivering saboteurs, commandos, agents, spies, and providing support for the many Cuban spies the agency maintained on the island as late as 1963. On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, Aspiaga got orders from his headquarters, intelligence headquarters. Stop all of your work against the CIA. The CIA is not your target today. Point all of your antennas, all of your equipment to Texas. We want to know if anything happens in Texas. I said, what time was that when you got those orders? He said it was early. It was like 9 or 9:30 in the morning. Kennedy was shot at 12:30 Dallas time. I said, are you sure? Are you sure? He said, I am absolutely sure. Those orders reached me at least 3 hours before the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza. So I was pretty shocked, and I thought, at first I thought, well, what do I do with information like this? Is it credible? So how do you go about assessing a source like this, who brings you that kind of remarkable, shocking information? Well, you do what we all always did in intelligence analysis. First of all, you consider his bona fides. And I knew his bona fides. He had defected in '87, and I knew that everything he had told us, everything he told the agency and the Bureau, checked out. It was all, as far as I know, there was no exaggeration, everything checked out. His bona fides were good. I pressed him, and I did it. I met him on 3 different occasions, and in every one of those meetings, we went almost immediately to this particular subject, the most shocking of his stories. And I would always ask him, I said, well, tell me more, give me some more detail. And he would refuse to embellish. He refused to embellish, he refused to elaborate in ways that I think would have signaled to me that, that it was a tale. And I thought, well, I wonder, in the first meeting, I wonder if this is a story that kind of came into his head long after he defected, maybe after meeting with many other Cuban exiles and being infected by the anti-Castro passions of the Miami exile community. Is this maybe a story that he developed years later? Well, at the beginning of our first meeting, when we were shaking hands and being introduced, he gave me a manuscript that he had written. It's about a 300-page typewritten manuscript. And he wrote it originally in Spanish. He gave me an English language translation. And he wrote it not long after he defected, a couple of years after he defected. So that night after we finished our first interview, I thought, my God, I'll have to search this manuscript really fast to see if that story about Kennedy is in the manuscript. Because if it's not, then that might suggest that it's something that came into his mind years later, under the influence of other Cuban exiles. But it was there. It was in the manuscript. So that told me that it was not something that he invented years later. I was able subsequently to acquire a copy of the original Spanish language manuscript that he had written. A friend of mine helped me with that, and it was there too, in the same language. The translation was good. It was there. I was more and more convinced then. I was very skeptical at first, but I became more and more convinced that he was telling me the truth about the morning Kennedy was shot. I continued, therefore, doing research. That's when I started getting into the 50,000 pages of declassified documents. And fortunately, that had all been mandated by law, the declassification of all of those documents. Slowly, I began to accumulate evidence, and I'll tell you what the bottom line was. I looked at something that Fidel Castro said. About 30 hours after Kennedy was killed in Dallas, Castro delivered a speech in Havana, televised and broadcast in all of the Cuban media, 30 hours or so after Kennedy was killed. And Castro said, "We knew nothing about the assassin. We knew nothing about him, about Oswald." And 4 days later, he gave a second speech at the University of Havana. And he said, again, "We knew nothing about this man, Oswald. And furthermore, we knew nothing about his visit to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City in late September 1963. Oswald went to the Cuban embassy in late September, 10 weeks before Kennedy was killed. His intention was to defect to Cuba. Even the Warren Commission said that Oswald's intention when he went to the Cuban embassy was to defect to Cuba because he was so enamored of Uncle Fidel, as he liked to refer to him. I was skeptical that Fidel was telling the truth. And I was able to gather evidence from 5 independent sources that Fidel Castro was lying blatantly, egregiously in those 2 speeches about his prior knowledge of Oswald. 5 independent sources that I cite in the book. They all tell us that they tell indirectly that Fidel was lying. The first of those sources was the first defector who came out of Cuban intelligence. He defected in Canada in April of 1964, and he was the first source that we had at CIA who could tell us about the inner workings of Cuban intelligence. His name, I think he's dead. I haven't been able to find him. I think he's dead. Vladimir Rodriguez Laera. He was known in the CIA cables as Mug, A.M. Mug. A.M. Mug spent some time at the Mexico City embassy, just sometime after Oswald was there. And Mug knew the same intelligence officers that Oswald had encountered there. And Mug listened to the speech, the first speech, maybe the second one that Castro delivered in Havana. It was before he defected. And Mug told his CIA briefing officer, a great guy named Hal Swenson. I never knew Hal, but Hal figures prominently in the book. Mug told Hal Swenson that Fidel had lied in that speech. Now, I don't think that ever got to the Warren Commission, but I'm not positive. And I don't think it did. I don't have any evidence that it did. Mug knew that Oswald had encountered Cuban intelligence officers in Mexico City because he had been there. And he knew the intelligence officers. He worked with them there and he worked with them in Havana. And I'll tell you about another source for all of my FBI friends who are here. Because the FBI played a pretty major role in this, although J. Edgar Hoover kind of botched it, perhaps intentionally, by covering it up. The FBI ran a fantastic operation called Operation Solo. And the solo was focused on the Childs brothers, Morris and Jack Childs. They had been born in Tsarist Russia. They emigrated with their parents and they settled in Chicago. And Morris and Jack became early enthusiasts of the American Communist Party. They joined and they rose in its ranks. Morris eventually became the equivalent of the foreign minister of the American Communist Party. Now, they didn't have any such title, but that's the role he played. He was Gus Hall's designee to represent the American Communist Party in the Kremlin with the KGB and with the leaders of all of the other ruling communist parties around the world. And Morris did a really good job at that. And his brother Jack was a junior partner in this thing. They were they had been recruited by the FBI. Wonderful story about Jack being recruited. He was walking down the street. I think in the Bronx, somewhere in New York City, and he was approached by a couple of FBI officers. And it was a cold pitch. They just came up to him on the street, and they pitched him cold. And he said, "Where the hell have you guys been all this time? I'd have never believed in any of that communist bullshit anyway." So he was recruited, and his brother Morris was recruited. Eventually, their wives also worked in Operation Solo, and they provided remarkable intelligence on the Politburo, the Kremlin, the communist parties around the world. Both brothers knew Fidel, and Jack traveled to Havana in May of 1964, and he met with Fidel. They had a long visit, and Fidel wanted to talk about all kinds of things. He wanted to talk about the Communist Party, and he wanted to talk about the Black Power movement in the United States that, of course, he had been supporting clandestinely. He wanted to talk about the Kennedy assassination, and he brought it up. And they spoke a little bit about that, and then finally Fidel said, "Well, he said, I want to tell you something. When Oswald left our embassy in Mexico City, when he walked out, you know what he said? He said, 'I'm going to kill Kennedy.'" Now, why did Oswald say that? There's really no reason to doubt Jack's report. Jack reported accurately to the FBI what he learned, and that I don't have any doubt that Fidel repeated that. I don't have any doubt that he repeated accurately what Oswald had said. I think that when Oswald was at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, he was churned. He was motivated by Cuban intelligence. He was wound up by Cuban intelligence. He already loved the Cuban Revolution and was volunteering to fight for it, and now I think the Cuban intelligence was winding him up to fight for Cuban intelligence in a variety of ways against its worst and most dangerous enemy, John Kennedy. Fidel later denied that he ever said that, but there was another person, a British journalist, who reported that Fidel had told him the same thing. So two sources reported exactly the same thing, that Oswald said, these militant words when he left the Cuban embassy. And sadly, that report, J. Edgar Hoover did write it up, but he minimized it. He kind of camouflaged it. Hoover did not properly inform the Warren Commission. So they weren't really aware of this threat and of Fidel's connection to the threat. I was able to find another document, an FBI document. I went to the National Archives in College Park last October. The book was already with my editor in New York, and I thought I really ought to go one more time to the archives. Maybe I can find a few more things that will really be valuable. And I got the help of some senior archivists out in College Park, and they really helped. And they found for me some Operation Solo documents that I don't think had been made available to researchers before. And there was one document in there. It was a report from the New York FBI office, and that was the office then that was handling Jack. And Jack had met with the chief there, and the report to Hoover was that it's in the book. I have a synopsis of the report in the book. The report was, Jack Childs had it right. He told it right. Fidel had not been drinking. Fidel spoke in English, kind of bad English, but he spoke in English, and Jack was taking notes through the entire conversation. And we can tell you, this was a report from New York to Director FBI. We can tell you that this report is accurate. Jack Childs had it right. We don't have any doubt about it. And I interviewed an FBI officer who knew Operation Solo and knew Jack, a retired officer. And he said, look, Brian, Jack took risks. He was a real risk taker, but he didn't exaggerate. He didn't embellish. So those are just two of the sources. The Cuban am mug, 5 minutes? 5 minutes to speak, or should I start Q&A now?
To speak, 5 minutes.
Okay. If you want me to talk 5 more minutes. Those are two of the sources then. The Cuban mug, Rodriguez Laeda, who said Fidel lied, and it didn't get to the Warren Commission that I know of. And Jack Childs, who tells this story connecting Oswald and Fidel, the threat to kill Kennedy, which didn't get to the Warren Commission either. And I have three other sources that provide, that as far as I'm concerned, confirm beyond any doubt that Fidel lied when he denied any prior knowledge of Oswald. So why did he lie? Why did he feel that that he had the imperative to lie, and just within 30 hours of the assassination? Well, I'm convinced, and it's the ultimate argument of the book, I'm convinced that he felt he had to lie because he was afraid that we knew a lot more about all of that than he could ever survive. He was afraid that Lyndon Johnson would launch an invasion of Cuba if there was any evidence of a Cuban hand in the assassination. He put all of his military forces on alert that night. The Cuban military went into high alert. The Cuban leadership all began making the same kinds of statements. They were really, really, really terrified. There are a number of CIA analyst reports that were written in those days immediately after the assassination by the Office of Current Intelligence, where I once worked. Those reports all state how terrified the Cuban leadership was. So I'm convinced that Fidel knew that Oswald was going to shoot at Kennedy that morning. I became convinced over the course of doing this book that Aspiaga had it right. He didn't embellish, he didn't lie, that he told the truth, that Fidel knew. And Fidel didn't just know that shots were going to be fired at Kennedy. Fidel knew it was going to be Oswald. That Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who threatened to do just that, was going to do it. I get at a little more about it in the book. I won't tell you all the rest of the book because I want you to buy it. I don't argue. I must say this. I don't argue, I don't claim that Castro or Cuban intelligence organized the assassination. I don't say that they were part of an organized conspiracy. I don't say there were Cuban gunmen in Dallas that day, or any Cuban intelligence officers. I can't say that. I found no evidence, so I don't say that. I asked Aspiaga that question. Do you think Fidel was responsible for Kennedy's assassination? And Aspiaga said to me immediately, I can't say that. But he knew. So that helped me again to feel good about Aspiaga. Fidel, I don't know that Fidel organized it. That's a question for historians and for the future. Maybe if we ever see Cuban archives, we'll have a better idea. But Fidel engaged in a conspiracy of silence. He was complicit because he knew it was going to happen, and he didn't take any action. He hated Kennedy. A big part of the book is about Kennedy's very, very serious efforts to kill Fidel. And Fidel knew all about those efforts through double agents. Thank you so much.
Would you be willing to take some questions at this time?
Absolutely. Sure.
First, right there. Newspaper reporter.
Okay. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Ron Kessler. As a Washington Post reporter, I interviewed Sylvia Duran, who was the person who dealt with Oswald at the Cuban embassy. And she said what the Warren Commission basically said, which is that they considered him a nut. He became very agitated. There was back and forth with the Soviet embassy. They wanted nothing to do with him. And as for Childs, whatever he knew, of course, the KGB also knew, and dozens of defectors have since come out and said, again, that Russians wanted nothing to do with Oswald. They thought he was either a double agent or a nut, or both. So, in view of all that, how do you explain your defector?
Well, Ron, I don't say anything about Soviet intelligence. I don't argue that Oswald had ever been recruited by Soviet intelligence. I don't even make the argument that some have that the KGB provided intelligence files on Oswald to their Cuban counterparts. I don't know. I don't have any evidence for that. It could easily have been the case, but I do have evidence that one of the things I didn't mention. I do have evidence that Cuban intelligence was probably already compiling files on Oswald as early as 1959, when Oswald was a young Marine in California. And he was already enthralled with the Cuban Revolution. You read the testimony of Oswald's buddy, Nelson Delgado. They wanted to go and fight for Fidel, Oswald and this Puerto Rican boy he was buddies with in California. So I also depend on another source, Sylvia Duran. I never found her. I was never able to interview her, but you may know that a man named a Cuban intelligence officer who was the incoming center chief in Mexico City. His name was Mirabal. His Cuban intelligence code name, nom de guerre, was Eulogio. He was the incoming center chief in Mexico City, and he encountered Oswald. And he admitted, this was an odd slip, he admitted, this Mirabal, Eulogio, admitted when he was testifying before the House Assassinations Committee in the 70s, he admitted that he had filed a report on Oswald's visit to the embassy, and it went to Fidel. So that's just one more item of evidence, contradicting Fidel. So it was Fidel's own intelligence officer contradicted
Of course, Castro lied about when he said that he knew nothing about Oswald, but that doesn't mean that, in fact, he actually knew anything about the assassination. He would have had to have Oswald, somehow after that, contacting the Cubans.
That's in the last.
You couldn't just pick up the phone
obviously
and call Cuba.
That's what I left out, but it's in the book.
All right.
Thanks.
The microphone in the back is next.
My name is Mike Williams, no affiliation. How do you account for the Nozenko information such as it was after the assassination?
I don't get into Nozenko at all. It's one of those enduring questions. It's one that, frankly, I'm not expert on, and I know many of you are. I didn't think it was directly relevant to the case any of the cases that I was making.
Okay.
Sorry.
Brian, nice to see you again. Tom Reckford.
Hi, Tom.
In your previous excellent book, After Fidel, you wrote a lot about the two brothers. And you wrote that Raul was basically in charge of security. How involved was Raul in the intelligence operations?
Yeah, Tom, thanks. He wasn't much involved at all until more recent years. Raul ran the armed forces. He was the defense minister. There's Raul Castro, who's now the president of Cuba, as everybody knows. Raul Castro said once, not long ago, that he was the world's longest-serving defense minister. He meant in all of history, the longest defense minister ever, 49 years or 50 years as Cuba's defense minister. He ran the armed forces. Other people ran intelligence, and their names are in the book. But in 1989, there was a big purge, and Raul did take over through one of his cronies all of the security and intelligence agencies. So the intelligence agencies since '89 have been indirectly reporting to Raul through this crony of his, a 3-star general. And now, of course, as president, he runs it. But I do not make the argument that Raul has ever played the role of supreme spy master the way Fidel did. it's in Fidel's, just in his genes, just in his personality. It's just he's intuitively a conspirator. He's intuitively a person who wants to manipulate and deceive and work behind the scenes and in the background. And like Lenin, it's just a part of him. It's in his viscera, but it's not in Raoul's personality. It's not present.
Frank?
Yes, the relationship between Cuba and Soviet intelligence, it begins right in *59, but it seems to be a conflicted relationship, and there were defectors later on like Peraza and Castro, who wrote the book that he wrote, that the KGB took over, but that happened in the late '60s, but earlier they were able to displace Manuel Pinheiro, and what was that about, and how could they do that if Fidel really didn't want them?
Well, you got to be careful with some of the sources, Frank. I'm very skeptical about much of that. The KGB certainly did play a big role in helping to jumpstart Cuban intelligence, when it's in its infancy. I talk about that. There were at least 5 Soviet, very, very high-level Soviet advisors who came and helped get the DGI going in the beginning. But the Cubans under Fidel and under his hand-chosen intelligence leaders like Redbeard Pinheiro and Ramiro Valdez, the Cubans learned very quickly. And they learned partly from us, too, from our mistakes. And they learned from the KGB. And they got going really fast. I compare it to Israel. When Israel became independent in '48, the leadership there realized immediately we've got to quickly, rapidly, urgently develop offensive, defensive intelligence capabilities, or we're going to be overwhelmed by our enemies. And Fidel felt exactly the same way. He knew that he was going to be at war, sustained war with the United States, and he knew immediately he had to do what the Israelis did. And Cuban intelligence, in many respects, quickly got better than their teachers, better than the KGB. And Aspiaga gave me a lot of examples about how the Cubans quickly exceeded and excelled in areas where the KGB was poor. I don't know that Pinheiro was ousted because of Soviet pressures. I don't know that. I think it might have been for other reasons. I think it was for foreign policy reasons, not directly associated with the Soviets. It's complicated stuff.
The microphone in the back will be the last question before we take a short break.
My name's Don Kirk. I'm curious, and you might talk about it in the book, in all of the research that you did Cuba provide any assistance to Oswald, training? Obviously, they met with him in the embassy in Mexico. For instance, the shot that he made.
I can't say. I have no evidence that they did. No evidence at all. He bought the rifle. It was a mail order rifle that he bought for not much money. He bought it. You know what alias he used when he bought the rifle? This is an interesting little fact. A.J. Fidel, H-I-D-E-L-L. He invented this alias to rhyme with his idol, Fidel, A.J. Fidel. That was the alias he used to buy the rifle. It was the alias he used when he established a notional chapter in New Orleans of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He idolized Fidel. But no, I didn't find any evidence of a Cuban hand.
So the last involvement with Oswald was in Mexico.
Well, there must have been. This is what I left out of my presentation, and I leave for you to read in the book and see if you find it convincing. There had to be some kind of contact after he left Mexico City.
I was wondering.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for a break, but first I would like to present the AFIO standard enlightening device. It's well known. It's by Smith & Wesson. It'll help protect you from the dark in Havana if you ever get back.
Does it fire? Thank you.
We can take about 10 minutes break now, and then they'll be setting the tables while we're out. Be back here at 12. Thank you.